Hi. Today I'm planning to discuss about how to properly handle any exceptions, right? Like not about handling, but uh, when we send back the exception to client, okay, how to handle it, okay. So in general, like when we send like the client is looking for a resource from my API, and in case if I'm not able to find from my data store, or in case like if the request the client sending is not valid, okay, I cannot just go and throw some exception to the client. I need to make the message to the client clear, like what they need to do to fix this, the mitigation plan, right? Like in any kind of information which can help the client to understand why the issue is and what they need to do to mitigate that error, okay. So when we send it, we need to send a proper error code, okay. So that is another priority we need to see, okay. To resolve, to help the client to understand the error, okay. So and also make sure like we are not adding any sensitive informations with our response, okay. So these are a few things we need to do when we send the exceptions or error back to the client, okay. So when I say the response code, right, at a high level, if you see, these are the different response code, like we have hundreds, 200, 300, 400, 500, but a very commonly used response code are between 200, 400, and 500, okay. So these are the very most commonly used response code. Like we have 404 for resource not found. Like these are related to the client side, okay. So from the client side, like in the request, if we find any issues, like the request is sending me data to check in the data base, okay, or the request ID used by the client is not valid, so that is something wrong with the request, okay. So we can send as a request not found, or the format of the request is not good, or they are not authorized. So these all are related to the client, okay. That is why we are using the 400, okay. And a 500 is a server error. Server error means like anything from our application side, okay. Like I'm not able to interact with another and interact with the database. So those are related to the server errors, okay. So we need to make sure we are using one of these valid error code, sending back to send response back to the client, okay. So let's say, like for example, like I'm just sending an exception, right. I'm getting a request and then returning back the exception. So how the default response looks like: we have a timestamp, we have a status, and there is error message and a path. Like if you see, there is no error message, like it's a kind of a vague, right. Like okay, they can see a status, and they like it cannot be a valid one, right. um, there can be a issue with the server, but still we are setting a status of 104. This was not found, okay. So to customize this, what we can do, like we can do a lot of customization for this, okay. Let's say, like for example, I'm going to throw a student not found exception from my API, right. So how the response look like here, instead of I will see a 500 error status, right. But this is not really a server side error. This is something on the client side, like client is sending me some invalid ID to check, right. So this doesn't really make no sense. So to resolve it, what we can do, okay. So on top of the student not found exception, right, we can define, okay, in the Spring Boot there is a way to define what is the response status, okay. If you define that, okay, then the status get changed. So this actually makes some sense, right. So it is your error, client, go and make changes in this message ID. So that is what we are trying to tell them, okay. The message ID you are saying to us is not found. So this makes sense, right. So this makes sense, but on top of this, if you still want to add more messages, then it is better to have a entity bean and populate the entity bean with all your details and send that back to the client. So that is what we are doing here. Like there is an advice. So what I'm doing here, I'm creating the error details object, put everything into the error details object, and I'm sending that back to my client. So when the client receives, like I'm sending only the valid things, like they need to see the message ID and the details. So this is a successful message. But yeah, I'm going to send only the valid stuff to them, so not all the junk things which they can see by default, right? So this is other way of handling the exception, like adding more detail on the exception response, right? So there is other way of handling the exception, like adding more details when sending the response back to client in case of exception. Hope you got it. Like yeah, so you need to make sure like you are going to send some message, some relevant message to client, okay, with a proper error message code. So for that you can use a response status, or you can send back the response entity populating all the details. So